The air was thick with the scent of burning vegetation as Captain Elias Grant crouched behind the wreckage of a destroyed Terran war machine. His eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. The Empire's walkers, towering and relentless, moved steadily forward, their heavy feet leaving deep imprints in the jungle soil. From above, sleek drones hovered, their lenses scanning for the faintest movement. The battle had begun, and it wasn't going well. A crackling transmission broke the silence in his earpiece. General Kadar Orales' voice, laced with disdain, reached him across the miles of hostile terrain. "Humanity's arrogance is astounding," Kadar sneered. "You truly believe your resistance can delay us? We will crush your weak attempts and take Terra Nova's resources. Your extinction is inevitable." Grant clenched his jaw, refusing to respond. Kadar's words were venom, but it was the arrogance behind them that burned. The alien general had no idea what humanity was capable of when pushed to the brink. Grant's second-in-command, Sergeant Tessa Harper, approached him silently, her expression grim. "They're pushing us back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not stopping. We can't hold out much longer." "I know," Grant replied, his eyes still locked on the advancing Empire forces. "But we don't need to hold them forever. Just long enough." Harper glanced at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Hold them with what? Our old guns? Our makeshift defenses?" Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the dense jungle surrounding them. "We don't have much left. But we've got something they won't expect." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" Without a word, Grant motioned for her to follow. They moved quickly, darting between trees and underbrush, until they reached the heart of a long-forgotten bunker nestled deep in the jungle. This place had once been an Earth military installation, a relic from another time, its purpose long erased by history. Yet inside it was something that could turn the tide. The bunker door creaked open, revealing rows of dusty crates and rusted equipment. Grant moved swiftly, his hands brushing over the forgotten relics. "Mortars," he muttered, lifting a battered yet functional piece of weaponry from one of the crates. It was an ancient design, simple but deadly. Harper stared at the mortar in disbelief. "That's from the 20th century. You're kidding, right?" Grant inspected it with practiced hands. "No kidding. This," he said, lifting the mortar up, "might be the only thing that can give us a fighting chance." Harper crossed her arms. "You expect us to use these? The Empire's tech could wipe us out in minutes. These aren't even up to modern standards." "I know. But they won't be expecting it." Grant's gaze hardened as he set the mortar on the ground, adjusting its position. "The Empire relies on energy shields, defensive tech that won't stop kinetic weapons. They think we've got nothing left but our fists. Let's prove them wrong." Harper exhaled slowly. "All right. But if this goes south, we'll be out there with no backup, no reinforcements. Just us and some old iron." "We don't have a choice," Grant said, his voice steady. "We've got to make them believe we can hurt them. When they underestimate us, that's when we strike." She nodded reluctantly. "All right, Captain. Let's get to work." As they loaded the mortar into a transport vehicle, Grant couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. Humanity had always survived through sheer willpower. The mortars, though ancient, represented more than just a weapon, they were a symbol. The human race might have been small and young in the grand scheme of the galaxy, but their ability to adapt, to improvise, to fight against impossible odds, that was their strength. Meanwhile, deep in the heart of the Empire's command ship, General Kadar sat back in his chair, watching the unfolding reports from his officers. His black eyes narrowed with disdain as he scanned the images of Terran soldiers scrambling to defend their pathetic outposts. "How long until we break them?" he asked his lieutenant, his voice cold and commanding. "Within hours, General," the lieutenant replied. "We are already advancing past their outer defenses. Their attempts at resistance are futile. Their weapons are primitive, and their morale is collapsing." Kadar chuckled. "I want their final stronghold reduced to rubble. Let the humans witness their own extinction. They have no place in the Empire's future. His lieutenant hesitated. There are reports of... Kadar silenced him with a raised hand. There are no reports I care about. We have superior firepower. We have advanced technology. This will be over soon, and we will move on to the next system. These creatures, he spat, are nothing more than pests. Across the battlefield, Grant's team moved the mortars into position. They worked quickly, their hands steady despite the overwhelming weight of the situation. The Empire's forces were now only a few kilometers away, their massive walkers stomping across the terrain, their drones scanning for any signs of human movement. Grant's plan was risky, but it was their only option. As the final mortar was set, Harper double-checked the coordinates. Ready when you are, Captain. Grant stood back, surveying the scene one last time. We do this now. We can't afford to wait. Once they're in range, we fire. Just as they finished, a flash of light broke through the jungle's dense canopy. The Empire had spotted them. Grant's heart raced, but his face remained impassive. This was it. Open fire, he ordered. The first round shot out of the mortar, its trajectory sending it arcing toward the Empire's position. It landed with a deafening explosion, sending shockwaves through the air. The alien forces, unprepared for the impact, faltered. The mortars were no longer just relics, they were deadly, and they had sent a message. Grant watched the chaos unfold. The first strike had landed with more force than even he had expected. He allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before focusing on the next move. The war had only just begun, and the Empire would soon learn that underestimating humanity was their greatest mistake. Let's see how they react, Grant muttered to Harper, a grim smile tugging at his lips. This fight is far from over. The humid air clung to Captain Elias Grant's skin as he crouched behind the dense foliage of the jungle, watching the enemy advance. The sky was painted with the blood-red hue of a setting sun, but the oppressive heat seemed unaffected by the fading daylight. Through his binoculars, he could see the Empire's colossal walkers stomping toward the Terran outpost. They were unstoppable, and they were coming. A soft crackle came from his earpiece. It was Sergeant Tessa Harper, her voice low and urgent. They're closing in on the perimeter. If we don't act fast, we'll lose our last position. We're barely holding them off as it is. Grant's grip tightened on the binoculars. His mind raced, but he kept his expression neutral. They had only one shot at this. We don't have to hold them off forever. Just long enough for the mortars to hit their sweet spot. Harper's skepticism was clear even through the static. If this doesn't work... It will, Grant interrupted, voice firm. Trust me, Tessa. They won't see it coming. Now, hold your position. We'll wait for the signal. He lowered the binoculars, nodding to the small group of soldiers gathered around him. The mortars were set, ready to unleash destruction on the Empire's overwhelming force. They had no drones, no air support, nothing but their knowledge of the terrain and the element of surprise. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The first mortar shell was loaded and aimed, its barrel heavy and primitive compared to the advanced weapons the Empire deployed. Grant's pulse quickened as he crouched next to the mortar, watching the distant lines of alien soldiers advance, oblivious to the threat lurking in the jungle. Firing in 10, he muttered to Harper, his eyes fixed on the target. Remember, aim for their energy generators. We hit them there, we can cripple their shields long enough to disrupt their advance. Tessa's voice came through again, quiet but with a trace of fear. Ready when you are, Captain. Grant didn't respond. He pressed the button, and the first mortar fired, its thunderous explosion shaking the ground beneath them. The shell flew through the air, crashing into a cluster of alien soldiers, sending up a cloud of debris and dust. For a brief moment, silence followed, the impact of the blast echoing in the jungle's stillness. Then, chaos erupted. The Empire's soldiers scattered, their armored suits flashing as they attempted to regroup. Energy shields flared, but they were too slow. The explosion had left a hole in their formation, and Grant's men quickly opened fire with small arms, adding to the disarray. The second mortar round flew, this time aimed directly at the alien walkers advancing on their position. The shell hit one of the massive war machines dead on, and the impact shook the ground with a deafening crack. The walker staggered, its systems overloaded by the kinetic blast. The shields, designed to block energy-based weapons, couldn't handle the sheer force of the explosion. It collapsed to the ground, sending tremors through the jungle as the alien soldiers scrambled in panic. "Direct hit," shouted Harper from the rear, a grin spreading across her face. "It's working, Grant." Grant exhaled slowly, allowing himself a moment of relief. But they weren't out of danger yet. The Empire had too many troops, too much firepower. They couldn't afford to waste this opportunity. "Keep firing," he ordered, his voice sharp. "Target their weapons caches and communication relays. If we can disrupt their command, we might stand a chance." Harper's voice crackled through his earpiece again. "You think they'll back off? They've already lost one walker, and they're still pressing forward." Grant's eyes flicked toward the Empire's command structure, an imposing, sleek ship hovering above the battlefield. "Cathar doesn't know what to make of us yet. But that's about to change." The mortars continued to fire, each explosion sending ripples through the advancing alien ranks. One by one, the walkers faltered, their shields failing to withstand the barrage. With every hit, their strength waned, and the Empire soldiers, once confident in their technological superiority, began to retreat. But Grant knew better than to think it was over. They had made a dent, but Cathar would not give up so easily. At that moment, a sharp voice cut through his thoughts. It was Lieutenant Marcus Venn, one of their own. "Captain, we've got company," he said, urgency in his voice. Grant turned quickly. "What do you mean, Venn? Where?" Venn motioned toward a small, rocky outcrop to the left, where a group of Empire soldiers had flanked their position. They had been bypassed during the initial attack and were now closing in, weapons drawn. "Damn it," Grant muttered. "Tessa, fall back to the secondary position. Venn, get your squad to intercept them." Venn hesitated. "Are we going to be able to hold this line?" Grant's eyes hardened as he surveyed the battlefield. "We don't have a choice. We can't let them regroup. Move, now!" The battle was turning chaotic. Despite the damage caused by the mortars, the Empire soldiers had regrouped faster than anticipated, adapting to the new threat with surprising efficiency. Their commanders, no longer underestimating the Terrans, began coordinating their forces with renewed focus. Grant knew Cathar would be watching closely. The Empire's commander was far from predictable. As much as Grant had hoped to catch him off guard, Cathar was likely already formulating his next move. The human success would only enrage the general further. "Venn, report," Grant barked into his comms. Venn's voice came back, strained and desperate. "We're holding them, Captain. But there are more, too many to handle." Grant's mind raced. They had disrupted the Empire's momentum, but now they were out of options. If they couldn't break through the alien encirclement, this victory would be nothing more than a fleeting moment. "Fall back to the main defense line," Grant ordered. "We hold there until the mortars are ready for another round. We hit them again, and we hit them hard." As Grant turned to move, he caught sight of the alien command ship descending. It was only a matter of time before Cathar launched a counterattack, one that would test their resolve. The battle had only just begun, and Grant knew one thing for certain: no matter how far they pushed back, the Empire would not let up. Cathar's arrogance would drive him to retaliate, and when that happened, the humans would need every last ounce of strength they had. "We're just getting started," Grant muttered to himself, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. The first strike had been successful, but the real test lay ahead. The Empire wouldn't stop until they had crushed them completely. And that was something Grant refused to let happen. Not today. The jungle was alive with noise. The heavy thud of the Empire's walkers reverberated through the ground, shaking the trees and stirring the leaves. A low hum filled the air, as drones flew overhead, scanning the thick canopy. The once boisterous sounds of the forest had been replaced by the sterile noise of war. Grant crouched low, his eyes trained on the advancing enemy, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, adjusting, preparing. The initial success of their surprise mortar strikes had left the Empire reeling, but now the tide was turning. The walkers, which had once seemed invincible, were now vulnerable. They had learned their lesson quickly. Cathar was no fool. If there was one thing Grant had come to understand about the Empire's command, it was that their response to failure was swift and brutal. "We've got to move fast," Grant said to Sergeant Harper, his voice clipped as he surveyed their position. The small defensive line they'd built out of hastily constructed barriers was crumbling. "We've made a dent, but they'll regroup." Harper nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They've adapted. We can't keep up the mortar fire indefinitely. We're running low on ammo." "I know," Grant said, his jaw tightening. "We're going to need to hit them with everything we've got." A new voice crackled through his comms, "Lieutenant Venn. Captain, we've got movement. A second wave is coming in, and they're bringing in something heavier. More walkers. They're advancing from the north." Grant's stomach churned. The last thing they needed was more walkers. They were already struggling to hold their ground, and if they were going to survive, they had to take down the Empire's command structure, cut off the head of the snake. "Hold your ground," Grant ordered. "We're pulling back to the main base. Let's make sure they don't get past us." His eyes flicked to the jungle surrounding them. Their position was quickly becoming untenable. The Empire was too organized, their technology too advanced. And yet, there was something about them that made Grant's resolve harden. "Fall back. Fall back to the secondary line," Grant shouted, waving his men toward the extraction point. The soldiers moved quickly, abandoning their positions as the Empire's second wave closed in. Their retreat wasn't without its cost. A few of their men were caught in the open, a burst of energy weapons cutting through the air, slamming into the jungle floor, sending up plumes of dirt and debris. "Keep moving!" Harper shouted, grabbing one of the wounded soldiers by the arm and pulling him along. "Move, damn it!" Grant turned his head to see the rest of the unit retreating in good order, but there was no denying the pressure mounting. The Empire was relentless, and the mortars, though effective, were no longer enough to keep them at bay. By the time they reached the secondary line, the Empire had advanced to within striking distance of their base. The once proud outpost was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. There would be no reinforcements. No other line of defense. Cathar's forces were closing in. Grant didn't hesitate. He grabbed his comms again, his voice steady despite the pressure. "This is it. We've got one shot at this. We make our stand here." Harper was beside him in an instant, her expression grim. "And if we don't?" "If we don't, then we've already lost," Grant replied, meeting her gaze. "But I'm not ready to give up just yet." A low hum filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of distant explosions. The Empire was setting up for their final push. Grant had to buy them time. He turned to his team, the small group of soldiers that had been with him since the beginning. They were battered, exhausted, but they were still standing. And they still had one thing the Empire didn't: heart. "Listen up," Grant said, his voice carrying across the group. "We've got a single shot to make this work. We know the Empire's command ship is hovering above us. If we can bring that down, we cripple their whole operation. That's our target." Harper's eyes narrowed. "How the hell do you propose we do that?" "Simple," Grant said, tapping his communicator. "We're going to hit them with everything we've got. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we have." The group went to work quickly, setting up traps, rerouting the few remaining explosives, and preparing the last mortar rounds. Time was running out. The Empire's forces were now less than 2 kilometers away, and the command ship was hovering just above the treetops, its sleek, metallic form casting an imposing shadow over the battlefield. "Do we have eyes on the target?" Grant asked. Harper glanced through her scope. "I see it. And I think I've got an angle." Grant gave a curt nod. Then let's do this. The first mortar round flew, streaking through the air, but the explosion landed wide. The Empire's forces were too organized now, and their defenses too strong. The command ship remained unscathed, hovering just out of reach. Grant's heart sank, but he refused to let the defeat show. "We need another hit," he muttered to himself. The battle raged on, but Grant could feel the Empire tightening their grip. The mortars were proving ineffective, and the remaining traps were all but exhausted. Their weapons were running dry, their options few. It was then that the breakthrough came, not from a weapon, but from an idea. "Captain." Ven's voice came through loud and clear. "The Empire's troops are distracted. They've got some kind of energy fluctuation in their shields. It's only temporary, but if we hit them now..." Grant's eyes snapped toward the command ship. The fluctuation. It was their chance. He raised his weapon. "Get ready. We're going for the command ship. Full assault." The soldiers moved as one. Ven's team, along with Harper and Grant, charged forward, their footsteps synchronized in the rush to engage. The sound of their rifles filled the air as they moved swiftly, undeterred by the incoming fire. Grant had never been one to hesitate, and now wasn't the time to start. "Now!" Grant shouted, and the final round of mortars erupted. The ground shook as the final strike landed directly beneath the command ship. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, as if in defiance of the Empire's superior technology, the ship's energy shields flickered, and with a deafening crash, the ship spiraled toward the ground, engulfed in flames. The Empire's counterattack halted as the ship crashed. Grant's men stood still, catching their breath as the dust settled. The battlefield fell into a brief silence. "We did it," Harper said, disbelief in her voice. Grant stood tall, eyes fixed on the wreckage. "Not yet. But we just gave them something to think about." The war was far from over, but for the first time, the Empire knew that humanity would not kneel.